human dimension.
Methylamphetamine, killer drug, savior of mankind, none of the above, all of the above. The UK has a particular interest in MDMA. We have 23 years of heavy ecstasy use in this country. 100 million tablets have been consumed every year for the last 23 years. Are we right to talk about MDMA recreationally and MDMA therapeutically? Can we compare the two? Do the morbidity statistics of recreational MDMA have anything whatsoever to do with MDMA when it's used clinically? Is there a future for MDMA psychotherapy? What do we think about the politics of MDMA? What do we think about the classification? What do we think about the use of children using MDMA? What we have here are a collection of experts in the field of MDMA, from psychopharmacology to politics to risk management, psychotherapy. We have people who've published varying different reports and some similar reports. What I would really like to do here is to have a stimulating and rousing debate. So what we're going to do is each speaker is going to give 5 minutes of kind of setting out the stall for MDMA in their view, and then we're going to open the floor for questions, and hopefully the panel will question one another, and you lot will throw questions at the panel. I'm hoping to not have to do very much at all. If it's not rousing or stimulating enough, I'll throw in a few devil's advocate questions myself, but hopefully I won't have to do much. Thank you all for coming to this. I think this kind of debate is long overdue in this country, so let's see where we go. And I will hand over to Val Curran.
I'm a clinical psychologist and a psychopharmacologist who studies the effects of a wide range of substances. One of those is that better?
Do you want to do that? Okay. Does somebody else who's not got a PowerPoint presentation want to start to give their 5 minutes?
Yeah, I'll do it. What the hell?
Okay.
I'll stand here. I don't have PowerPoint. Can you hear me at the back? Yes. Happy days. Right, okay. My three-month-old son does better PowerPoint than me. That's why I don't have it. My name's John Cole. I'm the head of the Department of Applied Psychology. That's all you really need to know. Essentially, I'm going to ask you a question. This is very interactive. If I were a researcher looking into the safety of MDMA and I applied to the government for some money, how many of you, if you were the government, would give me that money? Quick show of hands. That's way more than I thought. Okay, if I was to ask you, would you give me money to look at the danger of MDMA? How many do you think the government would put their hand in their pockets and give it to me?
Dangers of MDMA.
Dangers of MDMA. How dangerous is ecstasy? Right. Such is the nature of research that you've reversed what normally happens when I ask that question. Normally when I ask that question, everyone thinks the government should put its hand in its pocket and pay to demonstrate that ecstasy or MDMA is dangerous, and most people feel that the government should not pay to show that MDMA is safe. However, those amongst you who know anything around the science will realise that the experiments to show safety will be exactly the same. Okay? But what it shows is that there's a financial imperative for us to discuss danger when discussing drugs like MDMA. And this is why I call it the ecstasy paradigm. So therefore, I've not got slides or discussions of research studies simply because I don't think that's relevant. What I think is relevant is our discussion around the narratives of MDMA and related compounds, in that what we really need to discuss is why are we focusing on safety or danger when in reality the experiments are the same. What we're focusing on is our interpretation of them. Okay? And so therefore, that's all I want to leave you with. Simple question, is it the narrative or is it the danger? Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to follow now by trying to summarise the main issues, which I hope will help stimulate the debate. I don't need to tell you lot, but the benefits of MDMA are very clear. We recently used the Dave Nutt framework to ask 1,500 drug users to rate the 20 most common drugs, including alcohol and tobacco and other illicit drugs. And MDMA came up highest of all 20 drugs in terms of acute benefits, and second only to LSD in terms of chronic benefits. And empathy, as we've heard, as a clinical psychologist, is important for me. Empathy in a therapy such a situation is hugely important, and so the drug has potential benefits. We've heard how it stimulates release of neuropeptide oxytocin, which is the human bonding hormone. It's what bonds the baby and mother through the breast milk and through the whole process of birth. But this debate, as John Coles has talked about, has been based on harms for all sorts of political, economic and other reasons. The harms are in terms of what happens immediately after you have the drug, a few days later, so short term. In a long term, there's been the main debate, and then something that we've been particularly interested in is what happens after you stop. So I want to challenge what the scientific evidence is on these things. Acutely, we've given ecstasy in a horrible old basement room in St Mary's Hospital. People love it, even when you make them come in at 9 in the morning. They get huge kind of empathy. They really enjoy doing experiments. We have to turn people down. We get so many volunteers. But just to be fair, the science shows that it does have some impairing effects. It impairs memory acutely. So in this study we gave either ecstasy alone, ecstasy plus alcohol, 2 to 3 units of alcohol, alcohol alone, or just a double placebo drink and pill. And what you see clearly is that ecstasy, 45 and 120 minutes after you've taken it, does impair your memory. It stops you remembering words. But it also enhances your ability to control your impulses, the Dutch study shows this, and to focus your attention. And it speeds up your psychomotor function, but you won't see that in the newspapers. You've only seen memory impairment. A few days after use, we showed a long time ago, you get this kind of midweek dip in mood, a midweek low. But 7 days later, that's gone. You're back to normal. So again, it's only a fluctuating thing, which we think kind of coincides with changes to serotonin in the brain. Long term, there's been such rubbish written about this drug, such bad science. This is a paper from a very respected Dutch group who've done the only prospective study of MDMA. They took people from coffee shops before they'd used ecstasy and followed them through the brain imaging, cognitive testing, after some of them started using the drug. I don't think I've got a pointer, but I've circled, this is a memory test where you're shown a load of words and then you're asked to recognise 30 words. This got published in a highly prestigious journal, Archives of General Psychiatry.
Do you want a pointer?
Thank you. And what it shows is that the kids who went on to use used ecstasy, they remembered nearly all of the 30 words. After they started using ecstasy, you still reckon their performance was pretty amazing. Yeah? But what they did was to show an impairment. They said that in this group, 22% of them actually showed a slight decline, like one word. Whereas in the group who never used ecstasy didn't show that. Only 6.7% showed a decline. The authors concluded our data indicated low doses of ecstasy are associated with decreased verbal memory function, which suggests ecstasy-induced neurotoxicity. You don't have to be a scientist to realise that is absolute rubbish. Long-term, lots of very core neuroimaging studies done in the field. The best one to date is one done in Canada by Stephen Kish. And they did show a reduction in an index of your brain's serotonin function. Serotonin is an important neurochemical, especially in things like depression. But even though there was a reduction in current users, especially in memory areas, hippocampus, and in sort of perceptual areas like occipital cortex, if you look, it's probably too small to see clearly, but the dark dots are ecstasy users and the grey ones aren't. Nothing was abnormal in the ecstasy users. The overlap between the two groups was huge. No abnormality either in terms of memory or brain function in ecstasy users. We, the year before, using the same radioligand as Kish used to look at serotonin in the brain, found that when people had given up using ecstasy, there's absolutely no difference in their brains compared to people who used similar other drugs or no drugs at all. We've also shown, as well as John Wilson has shown, no memory impairment a year after people have given up compared to people who use drugs other than ecstasy. And John Halpin's similarly showed a paper recently out, no memory impairment of people who use ecstasy but not other drugs like cocaine and amphetamine. No withdrawal syndrome has been identified. Since we've been researching ecstasy, I've never met a single ecstasy addict. The American government neither are paying someone called Linda Kotler enormous grants to go out and show that ecstasy users fit the psychiatric classification for addiction. The only way she showed it at all is by finding people, over half of whom also used heroin. So completely atypical of the ecstasy using population. Right, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Val. Andy Parortt.
Okay, right. Thanks, Spain, for inviting me. So, like Val, I've got 5 minutes, and I think it's fairly quick. I'm going to explain how I came to believe that ecstasy is far more damaging than when I first started doing studies. So my first studies were in 93 to 96, largely interview studies, and we got lots of positive subjective reports. And this is when it was called an entactogen. So I did 2 or 3 papers during this period. And like many people at the time, I believed it was quite different from many of the other psychoactive substances. It was an entactogen, etc. However, we also found initial reports of problems. We had people who said they'd taken it, they had bad experiences. One of the people in one of our interviews said they wouldn't touch it again because their experience had been so bad. A few others said they'd had bad experiences, which was quite unlike earlier experiences they had on the drug. And also we saw recovery problems, as Al pointed out in the previous slide. So many of our users reported they had the midweek blues, which has now been well replicated. And we looked at that in a number of studies and found more problems midweek. So it's certainly a euphoric drug when taken, but it certainly has untoward effects in the recovery period. So if you asked me then, in 96, would I recommend it for therapy, I'd be very neutral. I'd say, well, it seems to have a positive profile, but also it seems to have negative effects as well. So the overall profile from my 96 would have been neutral. Okay, we then found the first study of memory deficits compared with young matched non-users. This confirmed an earlier American study, which was more or less a clinical report of 9 users who also had psychiatric problems. And this is now being confirmed in published studies. It's probably 30, 40, 50 studies which have found deficits. Most of those studies are controlled for other drug use, including cannabis. Rogers undertook a big government-sponsored meta-analysis in 2009, and they had 7 measures which they had sufficient data on, so they were done in 8 or 9 studies or more, where they could do a meta-analysis. And in 7 of the measures, they concluded that ecstasy was more damaging than the polydrug user controls. So the control group was crucially other drug users, not using ecstasy. The one measure they did find a deficit was NART, which was a measure of intelligence. But the other 6 measures were all memory measures. So the meta-analysis concluded there were specific memory problems with ecstasy users. We've also looked at higher cognitive problems, particularly prefrontal problems, and a number of groups have found problems in higher executive deficits, problem solving, social intelligence, and again, most studies these days need to control for cannabis in their statistical analysis or in the groups. You also find acute reactions. One of the intriguing things about ecstasy is the wide variation in individual responses. Some people seem to be very robust, many people have mild problems, and some people have quite severe problems. So we find this in the serotonin syndrome. And again, occasionally people develop quite a strong syndrome, and a small proportion need hospital emergency treatment. So if you treat the medics who work in emergency Saturday night, for the past 10, 15 years, they said they often have stimulant abusers, users, whatever they like to call it, in their hospitals, then almost invariably treated successfully. So people now know how to treat the hypothermic reaction successfully, and most people are released following down Sunday morning. But it is certainly a severe reaction. The midweek problems we've talked about. In 97, I found the first case of a psychiatric problem. This is a young recreational user who reported with phobic anxiety, which they attributed to being an ecstasy user. So we then did some studies and we found raised psychiatric problems in lots of ecstasy users. And again, this is compared with other drug users as well. Other users also have problems such as cocaine, amphetamine, methamphetamine. They're all associated with psychiatric distress. MDMA is not dissimilar to those. So 2006, I just said no, it wasn't a safe drug. More recently, I've been looking at the effects of environmental cofactors, and these seem to exacerbate the problems. So if you look at dancing, music, psychosocial factors, the theory is it's not just the drug alone, it's the concomitant stimulation which leads to the brain being overstimulated, and this leads to a positive on-drug experience, but it also leads to a negative recovery problems in the week afterwards. So we found people that dance the most report the strongest midweek recovery when matched with drug use. So it's a combination of drug and physical overstimulation, which seems to be a problem. I'm writing a review of this on the moment, and at low doses, MDMA has very minimal effects on temperature.
1 minute.
Okay. Firm effects there. Visual defects. Several groups have now reported subtle deficits in the occipital cortex. Social intelligence, which I think is relevant to MDMA as a therapy, this seems to be reduced in regular users. Neurotoxicity, the Kishnell paper, Curran said that the effects weren't particularly marked, where's big overlap. I'll talk about one area, the insular cortex. 51% of the ecstasy user group had SERT levels below the lowest region of the control group. So there was a lack of overlap. Many of the ecstasy users had quite strong deficits. So in conclusion, I wouldn't recommend it. I wrote a review on therapy in 2007.
Okay, let's stop there. You can bring in some of this later. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Thank you. Peter Owen.
As a psychiatrist and psychotherapist, I'm greatly frustrated by the amount of people I encounter in my private practice who I am not able to treat properly, because there are multiple reasons for this. Okay. There are multiple reasons why people are treatment resistant, not only PTSD. And as Ben said in his introduction this afternoon, we are desperately in need of ways of enhancing psychotherapy. Leuner, the grandfather of psychedelic therapy in Europe, once made the approximation that only 50% of people can be treated by psychotherapy. So we need something that can, an enhancer. And from my point of view and what I have seen, MDMA can be this drug, can be one of the drugs. And I strongly advocate to differentiate between the therapeutic use, where you administer one dose of 125 milligrams in a completely different setting, no physical exercise. It has been shown that, for example, the cortisol levels, when exercising, they go way up, and if you are lying on the couch, they're lower, much lower. Maybe that's one explanation for the damage that it could cause. We should investigate. We have the chance now, with these studies going on, to combine these studies with neurophysiologic studies. That would be really interesting and supports evidence of damage or benefits. Thank you.
Thank you, and Rick Doblin.
Hello. I don't have a PowerPoint, but I do have a stopwatch. Let's see if it works. Well, first off, I would like to thank Andy Parortt and all the other researchers that have looked at the risks of MDMA and of ecstasy. I think it's essential that we have a clear understanding of what the risks are. However, I think it's been the case that the risk data has been exaggerated and the potential of benefits has been denied. And so whenever you're doing a risk-benefit analysis, if there are any risks and there are no benefits, then you would conclude that it's not appropriate to use the drug. But it's been, if you look at Medline right now, and you put in ecstasy or MDMA, there's over 3,500 papers that have been published at a cost of over $300 million. There's only one paper on a completed study of the therapeutic benefits of MDMA, and that's Michael Minhofer's study. So that paper, though, has fundamentally shown that there are benefits. And I think Andy's data that he talked to us about how he's now convinced that MDMA is unsafe for therapeutic use, it all comes from recreational use of MDMA. So I think it's a completely inappropriate, although it's valuable, but it's not enough.
We need to look really at the risks in a therapeutic context, and we don't see the kind of risks that he's talking about. But even if we did, aspirin kills a lot of people. People are allergic to penicillin. We don't have to show, or we don't have to claim that MDMA is this rare drug that has no risks and only benefits. And the temptation, in a way, is for advocates to be boxed into that corner because the other side is saying there are all risks and no benefits. But what we're really looking for is an accurate comparison of risks and benefits and then a weighing of them from actual research in therapeutic contexts. And so I have seen over the years that the risk data has been used to suppress research into benefits. From 85, when MDMA was criminalized, to 92, when the FDA opened the door to MDMA research. 7 years went by, no possibility of permission to do MDMA research into therapeutic uses. That has now changed. Andy spoke about the first study of the neurocognitive consequences in 9 subjects. That study was funded by MAPS. What you don't probably realize, that was done by Larry Price and George Riccardi. It was done at Yale. MAPS, we are trying to be the leaders of the research into the risks of MDMA when used in a therapeutic context, and also the benefits. That particular study was done, I paid for the neuropsychologist to do the analysis. Riccardi was doing other measures, the tryptophan challenge test, things like that. And I got this report from the neuropsychologist, and it said there's nothing here remarkable. There's a few changes, but it could easily be attributed to the fact that several of the subjects flew in from California, that they had just received tryptophan and a tryptophan challenge test. They're unusually intelligent. There's nothing here. And to my surprise, years later, this turned into a paper with John Crystal and the neuropsychologist as co-authors. And I called the neuropsychologist, and I said, how could you do this? I don't understand the difference between the report that you gave me and the paper that was published. And he said, if you ever release the report I gave you, I'm going to sue you. And I was like, this is my property, I paid for it, how can you possibly do that? But you can see that there is a tendency to exaggerate the risks in order to get publications. So I think that the risk research is absolutely essential, but I think it's been highly biased by motivations coming from funders to justify cruel and counterproductive prohibition. And I think that the potential patients who could be benefiting from this is a major social cost that usually is not weighed into any of these discussions. So what I'd just now like to switch and just say that we have a series of phase 2 pilot studies all over the world, and we're looking at a range of methodological questions that we need to address. And what we're going to try to do is find out over the next 2 to 3 years what is our method, how do we refine the method, how do we teach the method? How do we assure ourselves that therapists in different settings are actually adhering to the method? How do we develop a double-blind study with a powerful psychoactive drug like MDMA? Are there cultural differences, and how do we figure out what they are and how to work around them? Is the cause of PTSD requiring a different treatment? Or can we enroll people that are victims of sexual assault and also combat-related PTSD and also car accidents? And our working assumption is that the cause of the PTSD is irrelevant. So then we go to the FDA and we say, here's our data, and we propose a phase 3 study. And if they accept the design and permit us to go forward, then we move forward with that. And it'll probably take us 3 years to get to the end of phase 2 meeting, another 5 years and another $8 or $9 million to get to the end of the phase 3. Then we submit it to FDA, and I'm anticipating that in a decade, if we're fortunate, we will probably have MDMA as a prescription medicine. Thank you.
First of all, for sticking to those very rigid time limits that are set, 5 minutes each. So a number of things really there. We need to be cautious about the difference between recreational use and clinical use. We need to appreciate that no drug is 100% safe, and we're actually looking at risk versus benefit ratios. Who would like to pick up on some of the points of some of the other speakers first? I want to just ask, in the audience, do we have any psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, or other people who work clinically with patients? Clients, you probably call them nowadays. Right, I'm interested to know whether or not people have come across morbidity associated with recreational ecstasy use in their clinical practice. No, I haven't either.
One hand over there.
Who's that?
I have.
Yes? Would you like to tell us about that?
By amino acid supplements.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
I've sometimes felt brought down after using it fairly extensively, but nothing that can't be corrected with amino acid supplements.
Okay.
It's just a matter of
So you're describing a mild adverse effect. My question was really whether clinicians have found clinically relevant mental disorders associated. So thank you for that, because we are aware that it does have mild subjective effect, negative effects in people. But the point I was making was, are these subclinical, or are these at a level that are reaching the psychiatric clinics and hospital beds? And my broad experience, and speaking to other psychiatrists, is they're not of a clinical level. So I just wanted to make that point.
Okay, well, I didn't intend to disagree with you, Ben, but I am aware of someone who had taken MDMA and under the influence of MDMA had remembered a prior sexual assault which had led to physical violence and she almost had been killed. And under the influence of MDMA it came up, but she wasn't in a context where she felt she could really work it through. And so she ended up checking herself into the emergency room and to the hospital to avoid committing suicide. Later she contacted me, this was in 1984, and I agreed to sit with her with another MDMA experience. And it ended up helping her to confront it in a safer context. And then from that, she decided she wanted to become a therapist. She now is a therapist, and she's worked on our Spain MDMA PTSD study. So that's something that's now 26 years ago, and she's had long-term positive benefits. So I think the context of MDMA is absolutely critical. It's possible to take MDMA in a setting where you end up feeling worse off sometimes for months. And so my question for Andy is, how can you really, in all good conscience, look at the risk data from non-medical, non-clinical settings and say that that justifies a decision that MDMA research in clinical settings is too dangerous to conduct?
Well, you described one study from 1984. Right, if you look at the Curran-Talbot paper, published in 1986, they had 29 clients. Now, these weren't psychiatric clients, they were friends and acquaintances, about 9 of whom had sort of psychiatric levels of problem, but they weren't psychiatric clients. Now, 2 of those 29 had aberrations to the drug, which lasted more than a week. Many of the participants had aberrations which lasted a day or so, but these 2 had problems which lasted a few weeks.
Okay,
so
would you be...
even with one therapeutic administration, you can elicit, you can engender problems.
Yeah. So would you be influenced if I were to speak to George Enrique and say, find out how those 2 people are doing right now? If we could get that information and give it to you, would that in any way change your attitude about the therapeutic research with MDMA?
Well, they actually describe this in the paper. And one of the clients got better after a few weeks. The other was given 3 non-drug-assisted psychotherapy for a year. So the problems of that 29th person were really quite enduring. And so they needed a fairly prolonged period of therapy after one session. And the problem with MDMA is it elicits all sorts of material, both positive and negative. Franz Vollenweider has shown this, lots of other groups have. I've been involved in a study in Australia where we tested people in a boring laboratory where people had to drive simulated cars, and we didn't get positive moods. And it's probably because the environment wasn't positive. In other words, what happens with MDMA is it boosts all material. It's a CNS stimulant. And if you're in the wrong environment, you may well have negative material boosted. Yeah. So in my final slide, I was going to say the crucial factor is the therapy, not the drug.
Yes.
And in fact, Curran-Talbot said the primary thing is the therapy. So my position is it's far safer just to give therapy. Because...
well, can Val cut in here?
Sorry, I just don't understand how you get different results from everyone else, Andy, because if you look across all the studies, I mean, Kim Kuiper and Ramekes, the Dutch people, they've done lots. We've done stuff, Harriet DeWitt's done it. Everybody gets these really positive moods. And as I said, we do our studies in a basement of a hospital. It's not at all a nice environment. And I think there's something odd about your data, that no one else gets it but you. And I also think that in your chat with Rick Doblin, if you take any drug, there's always going to be one or two or a few people who have a bad reaction, even alcohol. It's not MDMA specific.
The mood data we're most surprised at. We expected to get positive effects, so we were very surprised when we didn't. As you say,
Are you sure it was ecstasy you gave?
it's provided from Swiss pharmaceutical firms, so I guess the Swiss are pretty high quality. So it was 100 milligrams of laboratory MDMA. If you mentioned Harriet DeWitt, she and Jalinda Bedi in New York have published 2 studies where they didn't get positive effects. And in both those studies, the participants begin other tests in the laboratory. And what we wrote about in the paper was the environment. If it's in a negative laboratory environment where you're having to do lots of tasks and everything, MDMA probably won't give you a positive experience. If you're experiential, sitting in an armchair, you've got supporting people around you, encouraging, you'll get a nice positive experience.
Well, I
So
just
it's the
have to
environment.
agree to differ, because we do 8-hour studies. They come at 8 in the morning and we keep them all the way through. And on the MDMA days, they love it.
John.
Yeah, I've got a slightly different take. If we look at all of the neurotoxicity studies, we look at the brain imaging studies, the studies where tryptophan has been administered, if you look in the participants section, it clearly says none of these people had a psychiatric problem. Okay? So in all of the studies that have been quoted around whether they've got this, neurotoxicity or not, none of them had a psychiatric problem. So how do we get this notion that all of the psychiatric problems observed in people are due to MDMA and are due to neurotoxicity? Because people who are clearly demonstrated, according to the papers, to have neurotoxicity don't have any psychiatric problems. And I've reviewed plenty of these papers as a scientist, and one of the things that I didn't want to say because it's potentially libelous and there's a camera pointing at me, is part of the problem we have is that when challenged, the authors refused to draw the attention of the reader to that fact. I did it in every review, and every time when the paper was published, it was not there. And I think that what we've got to accept is that whilst there's a large amount of research, as Val has pointed out, a lot of it's done very poorly, but there's also a huge publication bias, and we have to take that into account when we consider that research. So.
Okay, can we have a question? Robert.
This isn't a question so much as a brief account. From 1981 until 1985, I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, and I had embarked upon a quasi-formal investigation of MDMA, where I had handed it out to hundreds of people. Me and my associates, this is how Rick actually got his first MDMA. When I had collected over 100 written reports of this experience, I took it to Daniel X. Friedman, who was president of the American Psychiatric Association and editor of the Archives of General Psychiatry, and I said, this is a new drug that hardly anyone knows about, that is extraordinary, and it may be the best thing that psychiatry has ever had. He referred me to Dr. Charles Schuster, who at the time was the director of the University of Chicago Drug Abuse Research Unit. And I gave him and his lab assistant some, and then in 1985, I was about to give a lecture at the University of Chicago on the curative effect of MDMA. This was the morning that the DEA declared their emergency scheduling of the drug, and Dr. Schuster and Dr. Seiden were written up in the Chicago Tribune as the experts on MDMA that said it caused this brain damage, this damage to serotonergic receptors. I was astonished because just 2 weeks earlier, Schuster was supporting my formalizing my research at the University of Chicago. So I went to his office and I said, how could you do this? This is just what happened with LSD. A rumor is introduced, and now there are still people that think that LSD causes brain damage. He took me into his office and he explained to me, and this is exactly what he said. he said, look, he said, I have a nice setup here. He had a whole floor of the Billings Hospital at University of Chicago. He said, the government gives me a lot of money. Sometimes I just have to do what they say. 2 years later, Dr. Schuster was appointed to head NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse. I think this story indicates that there is a kind of crisis of legitimacy in this whole MDMA debate from the very beginning. That this brain damage stuff is kind of contrived and misleading to justify a political position of the government, in this case in the US.
Excuse me, can I add something?
Yes, please.
Okay.
You'll have to shout.
Yeah, I'll just like to add a little bit to the neurotoxicity part of the ecstasy story. It's not possible to show. It's not possible to come with any measurements that really show it. The closest might be a marker, might be the serotonin transporter. It's definitely a good attempt to try to show or look at it. It's definitely relevant. And in a paper that we will publish it will be published in 2 months, we have also measured serotonin transporter. And it can be, some people view it as a marker of toxicity. We don't necessarily do that because it could also just be an effect of a state of serotonin depletion if this serotonin transporter downregulates. But what I think is important to say is that one thing that we see, and also a third study that has not come out yet from a New York group, we see the same thing as the KISH people. We see a quite severe decrease in serotonin transporter binding in the cortex, especially in occipital cortex. And it's not necessarily reversible from the data that we have, and also the same is seen in this New York group. So the jury is still out to see if there is actually severe, in heavy users, especially in heavy recreational users of ecstasy, if there is changes in the serotonin system or not. It actually...
Okay, thank you.
Can I reply to that?
Yes, please.
In the KISH study, they found variation in the reduction of the serotonin transporter. But what they also found is it correlated with two things. One was cumulative lifetime dosage. So the heavier users had less of the transporter. The second thing they correlated it with was the memory impairment. So the loss of the serotonin transporter was correlated with poorer performance on their cognitive tasks.
I know, and we actually see the same. We also see an effect. So the more lifetime use of ecstasy, the lower the serotonin transporter. So we see the same. The New York group see the same. So there's some kind of lifetime dose-response relationship. But what we also see, and what the KISH paper that you just referred to, and you actually didn't mention that because that might be as important, is that they see also a relationship, and we see that time since last use and the binding, and that points to a possible reversibility of the finding, so that the serotonin transporter might be downregulated, but it might get back up if you take a break and don't use ecstasy. And in our data that will come out, it looks like 200 days of abstinence when the serotonin transporter is back in business, especially in subcortical regions. We don't see that in cortex.
Can we just be very clear, actually? Sorry to interrupt. Yeah. Ecstasy and MDMA are not the same things. I'm not joking. I look at a lot of forensic reports from the police. I do a lot of court work for dealers.
What's the difference, please?
The difference is ecstasy is an illegal drug in tablet form that very rarely contains MDMA. Most street ecstasy in the UK at the moment contains benzylpiperazines such as trifluoromethylpiperazine or metachlorophenylpiperazine. It does not contain 3,4-methylene-deoxymethamphetamine. I can point at Simon up there to embarrass him, but we recently did the amnesty bins from Creamfields. There wasn't much MDMA apart from in crystallized form. So let's just be clear. Ecstasy is a street drug which may or may not contain MDMA. Therefore, we cannot say using it 500 times equates with exposure to a known dose of MDMA. That is just nonsense. When we're discussing MDMA in the lab, it's a dose of MDMA.
Well, I think, did you want to come back on the search study?
Yeah, thanks for that. It's interesting to know you've got more data. But I think, Kish quotes our study where we looked at people who'd given up ecstasy for at least a year. That was an inclusion criterion. And we found no differences whatsoever. And I think the other interesting thing about Kish is he found no differences in the striatum, which is where you would expect the differences to be. But I think we all agree it's the time since last use. Renneman's data agrees as well. I think 8 of the 9 studies that have looked at people reducing or stopping do show an association between recovery of CERT and time since last use. And certainly, our study took 2 years to do to find the right controls. We couldn't find British people who'd used stimulants and other things the ecstasy users had used. There weren't anyone in Britain. If you'd used ecstasy, you'd also use coke and whatever else. So we ended up getting volunteers from South Africa and Australia and New Zealand because the ecstasy movement has started later there. But I think it's really important how your controls are matched. And you're saying about heavy users showing non-reversibility. I would worry about the effects of lots of other drugs on CERT. I don't know how heavy users are going to be using lots of other things heavily as well.
Okay, thank you. And okay, we might come back to you in a bit. Thank you.
I would like to make just one point, too, is that the real issue, I think, is functional consequences. And that's where I think the assumption is if there's a change, somehow or other, that's bad. And we're already talking about, and Peter talked about it, how there are changes associated with therapeutic benefits. So first off, this assumption that any kind of change is bad. And then there's just this focus. In our particular study, we did neurocognitive tests with people who got 3 doses of MDMA, 125 milligrams plus 62.5 after 2 hours, and there was a slight gain in neurocognitive performance after the MDMA treatment, which is not to be unexpected because people's emotional issues, their anxiety, depression, PTSD affects their performance on neurocognitive tests. So if we can help people with their PTSD, we would assume that their neurocognitive performance would go up. Now, the placebo people who also had a 20-point drop in their CAPS, not as much as the MDMA people, they got better as well, slightly in their neurocognitive. So I think the key point is what are the functional consequences? And I would just like to I don't know how many people have recently heard that it was about 6 months ago, George Riccardi and Una McCann just came out with a new paper saying that MDMA causes potentially fatal sleep apnea. That was in the title, potentially fatal sleep apnea. And it just doesn't get the press that it did anymore, that it used to. There's just this exhaustion in a way with the effort to try to show that MDMA has these fatal consequences. And then how does it back down to a few doses in therapy? And that's why I say again to Andy that we really need to look at risks in a therapeutic context. And we are doing our best to study neurocognitive performance. We're going to start doing some sleep measures. We don't really believe there's potentially fatal sleep apnea from MDMA, but I think we need to really look at pure MDMA in therapeutic context and then evaluate it in a comprehensive way.
If I could, just one comment related to the thing. Serotonin is important for breathing. So when you breathe at night, that's controlled by serotonin. So if you're an MDMA user, you're damaging your serotonin system. That's what Record and McCann reported. But you had young, fit people who weren't overweight. Sleep apnea is normally associated with males who are overweight. And it's a disorder where you stop breathing in the night. And what was happening was the youngsters in their mid-20s who weren't overweight, and about, was it 25% of their sample had sleep apnea.
So how many have died then, Andy? Surely if
I didn't write the paper. All I'm trying to do is talk about.
Apnea, surely we should have a fatality count in the thousands. Sorry, does anyone else see the logic of the fact that there's no dead people?
I'm not defending the title. I'm just trying to talk about this.
Where are the dead people? It's a nonsense. I'm sorry.
I'd like to ask a question about the way in which neurocognitive testing is carried out. Can the panel enlighten me? How many of these studies that demonstrate neurocognitive deficits include urine drug testing on the day of the test? Because, of course, nobody's disputing that acutely intoxicated with MDMA, one can be somewhat disturbed neurocognitively. That is, after all, why people take it. One man's neurocognitive deficit is another man's party. And so So if you're going to bring someone into a laboratory and do neurocognitive testing on them and they're ecstasy users, and we've already asked the question, whatever the hell an ecstasy user is, because we don't even know what ecstasy is, how well, have we got some good studies that really control on the day of testing for any concomitant drug use?
Well, yeah, I think both our group and John Royce's group, their later studies, we used hair as well as urine, so that we could see what previous drug, hair is like a tree, you can see each centimetre of hair grows in a month, and you can see, you look at drug use in your hair. And in those studies, we found no difference between polydrug users and ecstasy users in neurocognitive function. So the better control studies, I think, Andy will probably disagree, show a lack of difference, really.
So when it's well controlled for, you don't see the neurocognitive deficits?
That's my take on it. And when they're better studies, they're bigger studies, they're better matched for other drug use, then, you know, I think you don't see it.
Okay.
You're probably not going to be surprised I'm going to reply. The Kish study, they took hair samples and they proved that they were MDMA users, so MDMA was present in the hair. They also took urine samples to control for recent drug use. So it's the Kish study is really, if you want to see a good paper, many of the early papers were flawed. It's an extremely difficult area to do research in. There are lots of potential confounds. But the Kish study, I think many people, as Val said, is now seen as pretty much a gold standard. The Buckart group in America, Elizabeth Renman's group in Holland, have done lots of very good research. But the Kish was quite remarkable in the number of things they tried to control, and they did find memory deficits.
Can we take a question from the floor? Is that okay? Yep, this chap here.
Given that we're noticing that there's some ceiling depletion of serotonergic transporters, have we considered other means of increasing that? I've recently come across the study of the UDD members, Jason Calloway, Dennis McCann, also Adeludin's part of it as well, where they found that they were more psychologically integrated. I believe they also found that they had more serotonergic receptor sites developed in the brain, and I believe that's to do with the advanced neuropsis capi, the MAO-inhibiting function, rather than the psychiatry of viridis. So is there any work being done on to how you might address the problem of serotonergic?
Well, I'll just say that in our clinical studies, we have explicitly decided not to try to co-administer any other substances with MDMA, because we want to try to get a complete picture of what MDMA does by itself. So we think it's way premature to conclude that in a therapeutic setting, there is some neurotoxic problem at all anyway. And then to try to do multiple drugs administered at the same time is just really too complicated and not necessary. So we have not seen the need to do that in clinical studies.
Torsten?
Yeah. I would like to introduce a study which was done kind of 10 years ago by Tomasius et al. Yeah. And it was a government-financed study, and I only want to give a short introduction. It was 5 groups they have done 5 groups, one without any drug use, one with usual drug use but without ecstasy, and 3 ecstasy-using groups. One was 50 to 100 doses, one was 100 to 500 doses, and one was 500 to 2,500 doses, but with other drugs used similar. I mean, at the same point of time, which is different from Halperin's new study. And this study was showing that the group with the lowest range of cumulative dosage of ecstasy use haven't had any deficiency in any parameter, and they have done a very thorough study with even PET scans and neuropsychological batteries and everything. And the funny thing is that the results of this study were published as a book because it was an end report of the government-financed study. But the publications which came out afterwards in the international literature, in the English language, they were putting all the ecstasy-using groups together so that under the line everybody got a damage. And not so much people are aware of that study, but I guess Mr. Perez, as a specialist, should be aware of that. And what does he think about the low-range ecstasy-using group and about these results, even with other drugs used at the same point of time at rave parties, etc.?
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware of the published journal papers.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware that it was a chapter in a book.
Okay.
So
this is the thing, how they fitted it together. So at one conference, I may mention that for text.
I'd like to see the...
Yeah,
if you could email or send it to me, that'd be useful.
It's done in the book. And the funny thing is, when Mr. Tomasius was presenting his results at the scientific conference, I was putting my finger up and asking him, what about that group? And he told the people, yes, you're right, they hadn't had any deficiency. But I don't want to mention that because I get funny questions then.
There's a chap at the back there waving. Yes, please.
Some recreational ecstasy users claim that taking 5-HTP day after can delay the midweek blues. Does anyone on the panel know anything about 5-HTP and effects with ecstasy?
We've experienced it.
Any scientific backgrounds?
Have you looked at the calm-down effect? So I know you differentiating between MDMA and ecstasy, but obviously you're talking about a drug which you claim gives a happy sensation irrespective of context, which everybody associates with, you know, in my experience, people have associated with very severe downhill feelings, you know, afterwards, once the effects are worn off, as a prescription for people with psychiatric disorders. How would you justify that?
Okay, thank you. I wonder whether Peter might be able to come back on this, because have you...
I didn't understand him. Can you repeat the question for me?
As I understand it, the question really is, can we justify the therapeutic use of MDMA when there are these anecdotal experiences of negative come-down effects when used recreationally? Is that right?
Yeah, this just speculatively, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, in a therapeutic setting, people are instructed about possible come-down effects, and if they are, they take it more easily, and they can access help if they need it. And people in recreational settings, that's what I see, often do not know about this, and they are not very well educated about possible negative effects such as anxiety or depressed mood, or when they get into a crisis because subconscious material comes up. So there is definitely also a need of more education about these things.
Education is the reason. So if people are educated enough about drugs, they realize that MDMA isn't dangerous.
It's all about mindset, set, and setting. And you can how to say, compensate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd just like to add that in our therapeutic context, first off, that has not been a substantial issue. But secondly, the way in which we conduct the studies is that the people take the MDMA in the morning. They don't take it at night. So they, first off, don't lose any sleep. They spend the night in the treatment center, and then they have non-drug integrative psychotherapy the next morning. And then we release them to go home, and then they're called every day for a week on the phone to check in to see how they're doing. And then they come back for non-drug psychotherapy on a weekly basis before their next MDMA session, 3 to 5 weeks afterwards. And then we repeat that 2 or 3 times, depending on our different studies. And so there are some times when people have opened up such painful emotional material that they're struggling to deal with it for a period of time. But it's not the idea that that is somehow or other such a problem that the therapy shouldn't be done.
Sue.
First a comment and then a question to Andy. My comment is I'm feeling so horribly naive and upset about this publication bias, publication suppression business. I mean, I feel naive because I didn't really believe it, but you've told me enough stories here. It bothers me very much, not just in the context of drugs, but in the context that in other ways I'm always defending science against people who say, oh, no, it's not just making it up. You know, I mean, the potential harm of this is not just to drug legalization, to a better world in terms of drugs, but to the whole respect for science in general, and that really bothers me. Anyway, I'm going to go home and digest this and worry about it. My question to Andy concerns, it's a very small point, it concerns this business about the cofactors of dancing and so on. You concluded that the people who dance more or do various other things more have worse effects. But am I right in assuming this wasn't a real experiment? I mean, in a real experiment, you take 100 users and you tell this many to dance this much and this many to dance this much. Presumably, you're asking them after the fact how much they dance, and they could be different people, or they could be induced to dance more because of things going on in their brain. The cause and effect could be the other way around. So I wonder if you could just explain.
Okay, we've done a few studies. If I describe one of them, we got 11 ecstasy users who agreed to go clubbing to their normal club. Okay, I'll reply to that as well. They were ecstasy users, and they agreed to go. They agreed to go dance clubbing in their same venue with the same group of friends on 2 different occasions. On one, they take drugs as normal. We weren't allowed to say take ecstasy, but the ethics committee allowed us to say they could take their normal, whatever it was. On the other, they agreed to abstain from ecstasy or any other stimulant. So they didn't take any stimulants. We also took saliva samples, and the saliva confirmed MDMA presence in all 11 people when they danced on MDMA. It confirmed their abstinence when they danced in the same weekend, the same group of friends, off drug. So we have tested this. And we've also tested surveys, internet surveys of people, and asked them how much they danced, etc. And that's where the data comes on the more memory problems. So those that report they dance more, report more problems.
That's exactly my point. It's they reported they danced more. Now, why does dancing more have a greater effect? It could be because it's the dancing, but it could be that they're caused to dance more. You can only make that conclusion if you actually manipulate this experimental.
If I can reply again, I'll reply to you again. No, if I can reply to you, they also had wrist things which are called actigraphs.
Yeah.
So we recorded their physical activity. And they had the same similar levels of physical activity dancing. They danced both occasions. We also measured cortisol, and the cortisol increase when they're abstinent was very little. When they're on MDMA, the cortisol increase was 800%, which is massive. They also got 0 change in testosterone, whereas they got a 75% in testosterone when they danced on ecstasy. So it's not the dancing per se, it's the combination of the dancing and the exercise, the dancing and the MDMA, which is problematic. They were ecstasy users. We tested their samples, the saliva samples, and all 11 had MDMA in their saliva.
Okay, we've got a lot of hands up. Amy.
Laboratory MDMA in a club, recreationally, sorry, is that what's the, if you took normal ecstasy in a recreational way, what are your views on that?
Well, how do you define safe?
What are all the risks you're talking about? What effects would it have?
If we look at alcohol kills around 4,000 people through direct intoxication per year. And how many of us would consider going down the pub after this talk to be safe? Okay, so the question is the danger always lies, basic principle of toxicology, it's in the dose. So whenever somebody comes to me and says, is ecstasy dangerous? I just go, what are you talking about? The thing is it's the dose of MDMA which may potentially cause an adverse reaction. If we look at the medical statistics on adverse reactions, for drugs like MDMA, the overwhelming majority walk in to an A&E and they walk out again. Okay? Usually the people who come in on a gurney and die are the ones who are polydrug users. Okay? So when we talk about the safety of MDMA in a clinical setting, there is data dating back to when Rick started, to when Frans Vollenweider did his studies, all the way through to when Andy did his study in Australia. No one's died. Okay? So the key thing, the question that you're asking is, in the correct setting, with the correct dose, is MDMA safe? Well, the fact no one's died, now you could say, well, okay, that's not an indication of safety. 100,000 people per annum die from doctor-administrated drugs. Okay? So we know that prescribed pharmaceuticals are incredibly dangerous. Okay? We also know we also know about the issues in the pharmaceutical industry. That's a matter of public record in terms of class action suits, suppression of data, etc. Sorry to just upset you even more.
I'll be more upset, yeah.
So the key thing is the question that you're asking is very, very difficult to answer. The question is whether it's relatively safe compared to the other things that you could do. Okay? So for example, if we were to use Dave Nutt's example of horse riding or going up into Everest, lots of people do it and lots of people die, but we don't sit around having debates like we're having now. So.
My point was just that Peter emphasised about the therapeutic setting. So is it really the context behind it, or is it the drug itself? Because I'm really confused as to what is most important, the context or the actual substance itself, the street version.
Well, I looked into this, and basically squaddies on route marches die of hypothermia. Okay, they fall over, fulminant hypothermia, they die on the spot. Okay, the incidence is roughly equivalent to the incidence you see in the ecstasy users. What's the link? Extended aerobic exercise, probably with poor hydration, probably reasonable nutrition. Similarly, if you look at the serotonin function of marathon runners, it's roughly equivalent to that of ecstasy users. And again, what's the link? Extended aerobic exercise. So the thing is if you sit around having a good time listening to classical music, why would you die? There's enough studies indicating the physiology of MDMA in those environments. And I think that if you look, for example, at the temperature rise of all of the clinical studies, most of them indicate a temperature rise of 0.5 degrees centigrade. If you look at animals, almost invariably you're looking at a 2 degree centigrade rise in core temperature. And the difference is they've got fur, we haven't. Okay, we're much more tolerant to the heat stress produced by this compound. So it's got to be the setting. And if you jump up, if you're going like an idiot for 8 hours, what do you expect?
Okay, I'd like to take a question. Okay, and this lady here, and then this chap at the back.
What I just want to say is, John, basically raised the question of how many people have died in clinical settings. But there's another measure, which is called a serious adverse event. And all of the regulatory agencies in the world require the researchers to report if there's a serious adverse event. That could be going to the hospital because blood pressure is increased and they needed some special treatment, or some psychological problem lasted for over a few days and they had to be hospitalized. There has never been a single serious adverse event in over 475 people who have used MDMA in clinical settings. So that isn't to say that it's perfectly safe. And I think what we have to constantly get back to is balancing risks and benefits. And I think that's what has been suppressed for so long. There is only a tiny nonprofit. We have a budget of a little bit over $1 million a year. We're the only people in the world paying for studies into the therapeutic use of MDMA. That's fundamentally wrong. There should be so much more government money, other major foundation money, so that in this context, we've been forced to sort of argue about, is there serotonergic neurotoxicity in the absence of any evidence about benefits, and that's finally emerging. And so I think you cannot look at the risk question without also looking at the benefits. And if I think you talk to somebody who's like Peter's person who did those drawings, if you say to her, if you remember one less word, would you pay that price?
Thank you. You've had your hand up, and then there's a gentleman at the back there, so yes, please.
Okay, I want to make two short remarks and one question. First, I want to congratulate Andy for coming. I think it's very good that somebody with a different kind of discourse attend a conference, because it's very easy to
I personally invited Andy and indeed all the panel because I have deep respect for all their work. So thank you for pointing that out.
And the other thing that I want to say is, as an anthropologist, I kind of find some resonance with this therapeutic discourse, this kind of exemption for therapeutic use. I find resonance with the religious argument for exemption. There seems to be sort of in the air some kind of exclusivism, that in this context things are different. And I'd like to go again for Parortt's talk in the morning, that we look into wider perspectives, because as an anthropologist, I'm pretty afraid to take drugs with doctors, no? That's a little provocation, but I respect a lot the work of MAPS. And what I'm interested is, what I find kind of this funny circuit system is that the whole proposal to study the efficacy of drugs is to try to see what is their effect, not counting expectations. So you kind of make all these techniques double and nobody knows what they're taking and all this kind of neutral context. But I find this paradoxical because we all know that taking drugs depends a lot on expectations. So isn't it important that we try to create this expectation that it will heal us? And how do you deal that in scientific terms? Because it's very important that we have if you want to create the therapeutic official use, you need a accompanying culture of belief in this cosmology, in this idea that it will heal us, because this is fundamental for healing. And I think this kind of conference gives a kind of setting for this, that it's creating this cultural understanding for all of us, that we have some sort of thing we can relate to. And that doesn't appear in the discourse. Everybody's trying to detach all these cultural elements to it, but shouldn't we bring it into stage and sort of, instead of get rid of it, try to elaborate on it, build on it?
There's a guy at the back who must be very sore with your arm in the air for so long, so please, let's have your question.
I was just worried about the interchangeable use of the words ecstasy and MDMA.
I know.
If ecstasy can be a combination of many different substances, then how does the term polydrug use come into there?
I mean, I think we've covered that somewhat, that it is very difficult to make any reasonable comments about recreational ecstasy users and combine that with what we know about MDMA. So, do we need to say any more on that?
What's ecstasy?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think we've already explored that.
Can I just make this quick?
MDMA is being sold as well, and
Yep.
that's adulterated. So it's interchangeable. You just don't know because of the illegality.
I think one of the hard things for research over the years since I've been doing this sort of stuff is that ecstasy's changed so much. There's been times when ecstasy was MDMA, and now it's rubbish. I mean, nobody's using it. But in history, it was good. There was good stuff around. And so if you're looking at the research over time, you think, well, if they were doing it 10 years ago, yeah, probably this is MDMA they're talking to. If they're doing it now, well, we've no idea. So that, again, creates a very odd literature and evidence base, really. So that's why, we have to go with the studies that have been much more controlled and really checked what's in the pills and, and all the body fluids that show that.
Yeah, I can agree. In the last 2 years in Swansea, we've had difficulty getting ecstasy users. So if you are an ecstasy user and you're taking pure MDMA, then please come along to Swansea and we'll test you. Okay.
Yes, this lady down the front here.
Alluded to the whole setting, and whilst we've got to take on board one's mindset, which is what you've illustrated. Also, I think the environmental factors, and you were talking about dancing, in terms of where these people were dancing, were the environmental factors taken into consideration? I.e., if the club had air conditioning, for example, if there was a garden, if there were safety measures in place for these people, should they need it? Were they taken into consideration in the environmental factors?
In our internet survey, we simply asked people. In the study I talked about where we had the people go dancing under 2 drug conditions.
But did you ask them if the area where they were dancing was safe for them? Was there air conditioning? Was there water available? So do you know what I mean? So that their setting was optimum, because it's all well and good to be able to conduct these studies in a laboratory where the temperature's nice and you have all these things available to you. But what about in a recreational setting where it's unpredictable?
We did a study in a nightclub and we did the ambient temperature of the dance floor and it was 25.9 degrees centigrade. at about 1 o'clock in the morning. We also found no temperature rise in any of the participants. So I think the thing is we do need to be careful that that club had air conditioning and it was turned on. And I think that that's a very, very good point. And people need to take that into account when they're assessing these studies, particularly if it's self-report on the internet.
It's also educating people that are going to take these substances as well.
Well, I just wanted to comment that the police have taken notice in the United States that some clubs will provide areas that are lower temperature than the main dance areas. And the police have used that as a reason to arrest the club owners and to try to take their property because it's a sign that they are aware that drug use is taking place in their facility. So that there was a case in New Orleans where the DEA explicitly said that if there are rooms that are 15 degrees or more lower than the dance areas, that is a sign that they can be prosecuted for having a club where MDMA is being used. So the American Civil Liberties Union finally was able to fight that. But what we have is a perverse situation where the police have a harm maximization strategy. And that's what we have with impure drugs, with reducing harm reduction efforts, because they want to scare people from ever trying to do it. And that's the idea, I think, that worries me a little bit about this concern about suppressing research into therapeutic use. It sort of fits into this overall strategy. We're only looking at risks. We can't have honest drug education for young people, because if there's benefits, then what are we going to do? How do we explain that to them? And what do they then believe about the other studies? So I think we have a perverse situation that we have to somehow or other get around. And I think to Bia's question about expectancy, for our research, we really have one audience, and it's not everybody here, it's the regulatory agencies. We have to speak their language. And so we must work within their context. And eventually maybe we can broaden out, or that'll be a bigger discussion. But for the next 10 years or so, we must speak directly to the concerns of the regulatory agencies.
Okay. This chap here, black t-shirt.
This is a different type of point, but I'd just like to make the point that having worked with survivors of sexual abuse, a very significant proportion of those don't respond to therapy. And being a long-term survivor of sexual abuse and those clients which don't recover, I think they think that the risk that they run on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis is self-harm and suicidal ideation. They'd all think that the types of concerns that we're discussing are minuscule. Given the history of working with these substances and the successes that seem to be established, that waiting another 10 years is appalling, especially if the debate is on the level that we're just talking about whether there's a slight drop in mood on a Wednesday. It just seems that the voices of those people who would benefit aren't here today.
I think that's a very good comment from someone with a clinical perspective on the risk-benefit argument.
And if I could...
can I just...
There are really no studies on the relative risk of leaving no treatment options for these people versus these...
If I could respond to your first question. If you're going to have a drug which severely depletes serotonin, which is the theory of the midweek blues, and if you've got somebody with suicidal thoughts, then that's a potential danger. So they may well have very positive thoughts and good therapy with you on the session. The problem is what's going to happen in the recovery periods 2-3 days afterwards. So that's one potential issue which I think needs to be addressed.
Let me just say that the FDA has recently noticed that, with certain kind of medications, there's a low risk, certain antidepressant medications and also Chantix that's used for tobacco cessation, that there is a low risk of a very small minority of people either getting agitated, violent, or potential suicide. So now they have required all drugs that affect central nervous system to include measures of suicidality. So we have included that now in all of our clinical studies, and we will be able to really have clear, definite data about that risk.
Andy Roberts.
Right, yeah. In my professional life, for the past 22 years, I've worked as a project worker or a manager in hospitals dealing with young, vulnerable homeless people, usually aged between 16 and 25. I was working in hospitals as a frontline worker during the ecstasy period of between sort of 85, 86 and about 94. I saw hundreds of young people take ecstasy, people from tragic backgrounds who had no life whatsoever, and I saw it revolutionise their lives to the point where they were transformed people. And to me, we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because the minuscule harms I've seen to young people working when I've worked in hospitals have been far, far, far outweighed by the positive experiences of those young people, many of whom have gone on to bright futures, transformed by their ecstasy experience.
Okay, well, I think we're kind of, Peter wants to make another point. Okay.
I'd like to respond to Andy. If you give ecstasy, MDMA, sorry, MDMA to a subject who has sexual assault history, and he gets depressed on Wednesday, it's not the same thing if he's in therapy or it's just recreational use. You will have a better therapeutic alliance with him, and he will call you up, and it will probably be not just a whims of his serotonergic system, but it will have to do with the material that came up in the session. And it's easier to deal with than just Wednesday blues.
I think we should wind this up, mainly because otherwise it will not stop. I mean, for me, firstly, I just want to thank all of our panel and all of you lot for really making my day. It's been a tremendous afternoon looking at all of these issues, and this has been the icing on the cake. It's really good to get everyone together, yourselves and these guys here. Thank you very much. I mean, for me, we're talking about... Let's all take this forward. Let's bear in mind that we have to look at MDMA versus ecstasy, we have to look at clinical versus recreational, and we have to look at risk versus benefits, because otherwise we're going to get confused. Thank you all so much. Have a lovely evening.